Welcome to Curious and Unqualified, a podcast about life in academia. I'm Eric Edlund, professor of physics.
I'm Jeremy Jimenez, professor of the Foundations and Social Advocacy Department. And today we're happy to welcome our guest, Professor Alex Balas from SUNY Portland. And why don't you tell us a little about yourself, Alex?
Hello, everyone. I'm Alex Balas. I'm the director of the Clark Center for Global Engagement, and I also coordinate the interdisciplinary international studies major at SUNY Portland. I have a background in political science, conflict resolution, and I did my PhD at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And I work mostly on European Union foreign policy with some more recent interests in history.
Yeah, and tell us, what have been some of your experiences that got you interested in that got you interested in international education? And you can go all the way back to elementary school or anything more recently, anything in between.
Well, I will go back all the way to elementary school. I grew up in communist Romania, and at the time you could not exit the country because passports were only given to the people who were supporting the communist regime. So it was very difficult, and then it was very expensive afterwards in the 1990s. So I traveled a lot through the medium of sports, watching sports, the equivalent of ESPN in Europe, that's Eurosport, and reading. So I really got interested in the world and became more and more curious. So I decided to study about international relations. I got interested in conflict resolution mostly because of my family, very dysfunctional, lots of conflicts. So I figured maybe I can learn something to help in that sense.
And has it been helpful?
Not really. I learned that conflict resolution that I've learned does not really apply to my family dynamics. It does apply in many other settings, though, but not that particular one. I'm just curious about the world and different people, different cultures. Learning from various ways of doing things. Again, growing up in a society that was predominantly Romanian ethnic. In my hometown, at least.
I think it would be really interesting to hear more about your experience under a communist regime. In general, could you share more about what that was like?
Ceausescu, one of the worst ones.
So it was horrible from what I remember. Specific memories. Waiting to buy bread for about 4 hours in line.
Just like being in San Francisco.
That was my job as the kid, and it was incredibly boring, as you can imagine. But then I would listen to all the grown-ups talking. That was the first time I heard about Cuba, and one of the gentlemen in front of me went to Cuba because Cuba, being communist, was friendly with Romania, so he went there to sell tractors. And I always wanted to go to Cuba after that, hearing the tropical stories that he was sharing. Also, I strongly remember being told what we discuss inside the house and what we listen to in the house, meaning illegal radio. That would be Radio Free Europe. That is not discussed outside the house because it could get everyone in prison. In the 80s, they would not be sent to the Gulag in Siberia, but they would be sent to prison. So I learned very fast to keep the difference between what's private and what's public.
I could see that would extend to people like teachers and other authority figures, but would that even extend to your friends? Like you had to kind of have a separate private life with your family that was different. So your friends maybe weren't even kind of welcome to these discussions.
So some of the friends that you came to trust strongly, yes, they would be allowed, but we're talking about 2 or 3 families at the most, because you never knew who is going to turn you in. So, the assumption is someone is always listening to what's happening, to what's being discussed, and is going to report you. So, to this day, I mean, I function under the same mentality, which scarred me in many ways. Yeah.
So I have Cuban heritage, and I've only been to Cuba once over 20 years ago, and a very similar experience. I was talking about Cuban healthcare in a positive way, like, oh, it's great that you have free healthcare, blah, blah. And at some point, my aunt calls me aside to the kitchen. She's like, oh, could you help me out with some in the kitchen? And then she pulls me aside. He's like, that guy in there, we've only known him for about 6 years, so it's not really safe to talk politics around him. So it was crazy to me. Not only like 6 years wasn't a high enough threshold for like trusting someone, but it wasn't even. I was saying complimentary things, but even saying complimentary things was just too uncertain to be addressing the topic. So yes, I certainly can relate in a very limited sense.
Right, because then I can totally understand your aunt's point of view, because then that person would report it up, and they could target your family in Cuba to be enlisted as informers. Yeah. So it makes perfect sense. Like, oh, there, someone from that family said something positive. Let's get them on our side to inform on their friends. Yeah. So, and then it's really hard to say no, because otherwise they come after you.
So it would be just stay below the radar as much as possible, basically.
Yep, yeah. Stay below the radar. One of the positive things was the fact that I realized, well, you can survive in dictatorships too, and
wherever that might be relevant.
Right. Well, as my grandpa always said, like, as long as we have enough food and enough wine, coming from a winemaking family, a wine country, then we'll be fine, and we have the friends. That's why to this day I say, like, people look at places like Cuba or North Korea or other dictatorships like Eritrea maybe. It's like, yeah, life looks really worse. But I'm sure some people manage to still survive, keeping their head down under the radar, and you can still have a good life.
Well, one thing I'm curious about is there's, I think, a lot of rightful criticism of all children being given devices at such an early age in the classroom and becoming addicted to it, and especially since COVID. What was it like to grow up? I mean, we didn't have the same devices when we were children, but we certainly had video games, we certainly had TV and a lot of channels, etc. So what was that like? Do you feel like you recall positives about not being connected because you had your imagination or creative games with friends, or were you aware of like what you didn't have and what was in other countries, and there was a kind of envy and you felt like you missed out not having those video games and things like that?
No, I didn't miss out. I'm certain I didn't miss out. No, it was you find refuge in sports, all kinds of games that you invent, and then once you start reading, like let's say like second grade, you start reading regularly books, then that was a refuge, and that was a way for me to travel to places that I never thought that I would be able to. Yeah, so I'm trying to do that with my daughters right now. I mean, they don't have devices or access to devices. Even if they watch things on laptops, it's behind a password, and we have to provide it as the grown-ups. So it's always fun to see the crazy games they can invent in the backyard, and I really enjoy that, and I hope it's going to keep going like that.
I'm curious if in Romania people were concerned about their homes being bugged with listening devices.
Now, you knew that homes are bugged, and the idea was that, okay, we're too low down the radar for the communists to target necessarily our family, but then you'd always be very careful when you'd have anyone showing up to the house, plumbers, whatever, anyone who enters into the house, you would be watching them at all times. Even if they were telling you to go get a glass of water, you'd be like, oh, come with me, because you don't want to lose them out of sight, basically, because they could bug the house. But there are lots of stories of this happening, actually. Houses being constantly bugged, telephones, the telephones, even now, like when I talk on WhatsApp, let's say, with my family back in Romania, like if there is something weird that we hear on like
some buzz or something.
Like a buzz, yeah. It's like, oh, okay, the intelligence services are listening in, which they're still doing actually in Romania. Thankfully now they're working for democracy, and whenever there's a scandal, pretty much a day or two later, the intelligence services are releasing the phone conversation to show that what the media said is actually true about specific corrupt politicians or corruption in hospitals or things like that. So, yeah.
I mean, I guess it makes sense in some context to have conversations of at least your very high-ranking politicians recorded, right? If there's a worry, especially if there's a worry about corruption. But that should be known to the politicians that that they're being recorded. And so the question I would have here is do people just operate now under the understanding that they're always being recorded? Or
people who grew up with under communism, even as kids, as like myself, that mentality is never going to go away.
yeah, I'm curious. I suspect I know the answer here, but what are your thoughts on things like Google Home systems, Alexa, these little units that people have that respond to our beck and call and listen to our conversations?
No, thank you. No, it's great to spy on someone. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting how we've invited the spies into our house,
Right.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I mean, I get the argument, like, well, if you've got nothing to hide, like, what's the problem? But it doesn't. You have some privacy at the end of the day. So,
Well,
yeah.
But it's also data profiles being built on you, right?
Right.
They
Yeah,
get to,
right.
know who you are and target you for ads. It would be the light end of it, but who knows what else this data could be used for.
And then you assume that you have nothing to hide until your very mundane conversations about relatively normal political stuff all of a sudden become targeted, right? Yeah. So that can change.
I forgot if this stat is still accurate, but I remember I had read somewhere that 150 likes on Facebook, and Facebook knows you better than your own family does, right?
Right,
So,
right, yeah. That's why I don't really use social media much.
Well, let's pivot to international education now and your experience with. Could you talk a little bit about what do you see as some of the benefits for students, for faculty, for the university as a whole for international education? And then a follow-up would be, in what ways has international studies been challenging to implement and share in recent years, starting especially with COVID, but then also anything that's happened since COVID?
Okay, so there are multiple questions here. Some of the advantages of international education for students. You learn about what your peers do in other parts of the world, and if you do go and study abroad, it actually is a growing up phase. So I really believe that. I see it all the time in my students. I saw it in myself when I was studying abroad, actually in the United States, coming from Europe, and you become much more confident in your abilities, and you also realize the world is such a big place. It's not just your small town, region, state, country. You are forced to interact in different languages, which is great. Your brain functions differently when you speak multiple languages. For the faculty and staff, sorry. There are lots of advantages too, because you can collaborate. I mean, historically, that's what academia is. It's collaboration at the global level, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. We're talking about 1100 Bologna collaborating with universities in Paris or in London and so on, or with Baghdad, which was the center of the world, academic world at the time, 1100s. So we always have this, and it enriches your research. It makes it better, I think. This exchange of ideas, and on a different level, it also exposure to other university systems can also show you how good you have it maybe back home, because quite often we're very critical of our own institutions, and I'll be honest, like when I go other places, I do appreciate some of the positives, but oh my God, quite often I'm like, wow, that is amazing how well structured things work at our university, and we have policies in place. It's not ad hoc, as I find out in many places.
I am perpetually frustrated by the amount of bureaucracy that we have to deal with to get things done. And I'm curious, kind of in a general sense, you've worked at a number of institutions now. How does the bureaucracy that we have here at a state institution in the United States compare to what you see in Europe, for example?
The bureaucracy of New York State, per se, I compare it with the bureaucracy of India, which is very high. It is, in Romania now, okay, it's actually less bureaucracy, but it depends on who you interact with. It depends on the person. The rules are there, but sometimes the people are the gatekeepers and create the problems. And I've experienced that quite often too in Romania. So the rules are not always respected. Yes, there is a lot of bureaucracy. There are a lot of forms. What is really frustrating to me is that, okay, we have a lot of change in the rules. The rules change often on how can you use funds.
You're saying here in the United States.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
What are the travel authorization?
The travel authorization form changes every year. I think every year they says, oh, don't use the last year's form. You have to use this form now.
Right. Can you use your own vehicle or do you have to use state vehicles? There are a lot of changes, right? So that's the frustrating part, and the communication of those changes could be better and more timely.
And I think you've also had quite a bit of difficulty bringing in guest speakers and finding the funding or figuring out how to fund these speakers to visit, right?
Especially on the state side, because of these changes of the rules and making it quite complicated. Yes, that has been an issue. But one of the things, again, going back to growing up in a communist country, is like you learn how to respect the rules, and make it happen, and go around some of the challenges that appear. So that's what I've been implementing here too. It's like, okay, I can't use this type of funding because of the bureaucracy hurdles being very, very high. Then let's look at the private funding, the donations, and so on. Can we use that funding? And of course, yes, we can. So far, so good in that sense. I don't have the time and energy to fight these changes, and I don't think some of them we're not able to fight them. I mean, they're just state decisions, right? So you have to abide by them. But if we want to keep having this exchange of ideas, we need to keep inviting speakers from overseas to talk to our students, to talk to our faculty and staff, and some of them may enlighten and really inspire some of us, and others may give talks that are not as inspiring, and then maybe our students and colleagues will appreciate more what we have on our campus. So I do come back to this idea that it's important, like, yes, we are critical, but it's important to appreciate what we have here.
Well, in addition to state bureaucracy, can you also talk a little bit about some of the changes that have been going on with the IRB? As someone who used to conduct international research, I've come to understand it's a lot harder to do for Americans, U.S. citizens, to do research in other countries. So can you comment on your understanding as to why that happened? Is there any merit to, do you think, and how is it impacting international research?
And Jeremy, maybe it's worth explaining what IRB is for people who don't know.
So for those who know, the IRB is the Institutional Review Board, which basically is an ethical board. Whenever you want to conduct research with human participants, they're a board you have to basically explain your study in detail to make sure that there are no ethical issues in terms of data collection, confidentiality, respecting people's privacy, respecting people's desire to remove themselves from the study at any time, and so you submit to them your study for approval before you can actually do any data collection.
Yeah, right now that is a problem that's impacting mid-sized state universities, at least in the state of New York, quite heavily. The reason is data protection. A bunch of countries from other parts of the world implemented data protection laws modeled on mostly the European Union GDPR. The GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation, which is actually a law within the European Union that doesn't allow institutions, companies, really anyone to collect private data. So if, for example, 10 years ago, you would have an apartment building in Romania, and when you enter the apartment building, on the right-hand side or left-hand side, you would have a list of the apartments with the name of the owner, and then how much they owe for heating, for water, etc. Right? Now that is not the case. You cannot have that anymore because you're not supposed to identify who stays in what apartment. Right? So me as a delivery, I don't know, for postal delivery or something like that, I should not know actually who is there in that apartment. So now it just says apartment 1. This is how much they owe for water, for heating, and etc. So it's very, very hidden data, and part of it has to do with actually the fact that this data has been used by companies. Most of them American companies. They've been sold and resold, advertising, and exactly what you were mentioning before. So that's the rationale. Now, in terms of the research, it impacts us because there have been cases where American universities have been sued by EU, by the European Union for breaching this data protection. We've had cases of American scholars arrested in China on the grounds of data protection breaches, not necessarily true. China has very strong data protection, just like the European Union. Other countries around the world, even smaller countries. And what is frustrating is that for a lot of our researchers, they have to wait about 1 year for their IRB to be approved by the legal system of SUNY, of State University of New York, for the mid-sized comprehensives, as we call them. That's what we've been told. They go every application by application. There are 64 SUNYs. Some of the big SUNYs, from what I understood, they're able to allow their scholars to do research overseas with human subjects because they have their own lawyers that can protect them. So in case of anything, in case of any problems. U.S. has been a laggard as a whole. It's not just the state of New York, actually. This applies to the United States as a whole, but I know more about New York. Has been a laggard in terms of data protection. Yes, we trust PhD students that they're going to collect data overseas, they're going to respect IRB, and then they use their own computers. Those computers can get hacked, and you can get actually to the data of the individuals they interviewed, and it can be problematic in the long run. So yeah, this is a big issue. But then again, you have European Union universities have been operating with this type of restrictions for half a decade at least at this point.
And so practically for you, what does this mean? This means, like, if you're working with human subjects, you just have to encode all of their personal information somehow so that it's not, if someone were to hack it, they wouldn't immediately see names and addresses or other information like that?
That's one thing. You also have to be very clear when you apply how this is not going to negatively impact the human subjects on the ground in the location where you are. So it could be China or Sri Lanka or Australia or whatever, European Union. Right. So, but yeah, you have to be encoding somehow and making sure that it's all protected, hidden.
So gone are the days of just having an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of table entries in it. Okay.
Right, and you'd have a 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you know that the 1, 2, 3, 4 is linked to these files that you have on your computer. Right, so yeah, that's not an option.
So it sounds like we have room to improve, but in the short to medium term, there'll probably be more inequality with institutions because the larger, richer institutions that have these capacity to have these support and lawyer systems, those professors can conduct international research easier than mid and smaller institutions.
Correct. And it has impact on tenure portfolio, tenure promotions, and so on, because it's going to take much longer for some of our colleagues to be able to do their research, or they would have to change it. There are some loopholes in the rules about the data collection working with human subjects. For example, if it's oral history, that can actually apparently be allowed much easier. But then again, the problem is you have a backlog of cases that need to be looked at by the SUNY Legal. So that's going to take a long time.
I didn't realize that SUNY Legal at the state level was involved. I know we have our own IRB board on campus, but they just then make a recommendation to the state level? Is that how it works?
There are two different aspects. The IRB, they can say, yes, your research is ethical, but then you have to go overseas, and then SUNY Legal has to approve it too, actually. At this point, for this research with human subjects.
In particular for the overseas work.
Right, right. And the backlog is 9 to 12 months, pretty much.
And that's after it gets approved on campus, which could also be a year or so. You've had this problem, Jeremy, right?
Well, I used to regularly conduct research in other countries, and since these changes, like seeing that time horizon to collect data, I've just pivoted to doing studies in the United States, doing U.S. participants, because it doesn't seem worth it to me that time to wait, because then and that's if it gets approved, right? You're not even guaranteed that you're going to get approved, right? You might wait through all this time, and
they come back with recommendations for changes, and then you start the cycle over again.
I mean, one way to go around it, again, thinking in this is a challenge. How can we go around this challenge? We can do a lot of human research from afar. Remotely, right? I mean, questionnaires, interviews, all of this that we used to do in person. Now we can actually do it remotely.
Oh, so the data protection laws, if you were like to interview someone in Finland, that wouldn't fall under the same data protections if you were to go to Finland to interview them.
Right. So as far as I understand, then you would be a little bit more covered. But especially this would help not in case of lawsuits. They can still you can still be sued as an institution, but in case of doing interviews in countries that are not friendly to the United States and they're looking for scapegoats, a professor can be an easy scapegoat, so you're not going to get arrested.
Although that does seem like somewhat of a loophole to make it easier, but I just think so much of like a lot of the interviews I've done at the countries, they've been through like snowball sampling, right, where you make a plan, you make connections to interview them, and they're like, hey, you really should talk to my friend here. And while that could technically happen over Zoom, I have found, understandably, I think there's less trust issue of a person on Zoom you never had met, whereas if you could actually meet them in person, have a coffee, talk about your study first, it's a little easier to make them more amenable to do studies.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that, yeah. So one part of this has to do also with the fact that American mentality is that we're going to get sued. And yes, lawsuits have happened, but we're talking just a few. And there are countries, okay, the European Union does like to sue, big corporations in the United States. They go after the universities too, need be here in the United States. But other countries that are smaller, they don't have this suing mentality, right? So why are we worried about, I don't know, Sri Lanka, like doing research in Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka is not going to come and sue American universities. It's very unlikely, let's put it like that, that something like this would happen. So I understand the fear of suing illegal, but I also would see, okay, there are differentiations that need to be made, that not every country, every case needs to be put in the same basket. So maybe I understand resources are limited, but there should be some separation. Like, okay, are there some research projects that could be fast-tracked?
And so I want to now pivot to the student experience. And so I'm curious, from your many years in international studies, have you noticed any changes over time with how students appreciate international issues, seek out study abroad programs, show up to international events? Like, have you found any changes either in space or time?
Yeah.
And I guess along with that might be a changing opinion of the administration towards support for international studies.
Right. Yeah, so definitely there's been a decrease of interest in the student body since the pandemic, since spring of 2020. And I've noticed that on our campus. It's a trend that's national in the United States. Less interest in what's going on in the world, less interest to do international studies as a major, and understand politics, economics, sociology, anthropology, and so on. History about other parts of the world. So the pandemic, I think, scared a lot of people. The pandemic is something foreign. It didn't start in the United States. It's seen as something coming from overseas, and it did come from overseas, literally from China, where it started. And then the politics, you have a bunch of politicians also that are very critical of anything international. And I think there is a certain part of American society that makes the argument, well, it's better we forget about the rest of the world and it's just us, withdraw into some kind of isolationism. It's at this day and age, it's not going to work. The world is too interconnected. I can understand that. I can understand that frustration with some certain groups within U.S. society. Look, when everyone uses smartphones or laptops, computers, kitchen appliances, they have hundreds of components, and those components come from a couple dozen countries around the world, right? We're not going to start making our own smartphones or laptops or kitchen appliances in the backyard or in the United States. Only using American products at the end of the day and American components. That's the reality of it. So we have to work in this world. It's interdependent. It's so incredibly interdependent.
Well, I think a lot of Americans might be like, oh, we're happy taking the resources from those places and exploiting those people, not keeping them out of our country and not letting them come to our country.
Do you have a sense of whether the changing student attitudes towards international study abroad programs comes about more because of a sense of fear, as you were describing, or is there also a part of it that you think is just like a changing sense of curiosity? Like people are just not that interested in looking abroad?
No, I think a lot of it has to do with fear of overseas, especially when you see a lot of stories that, okay, this person from overseas did this and so on. But the lack of curiosity, I think that's a generational trend, and I'm seeing that at the global level. I'm not just seeing it in the United States. I mean, I've taught in Europe too. I see that in Europe also, like this lack of curiosity. That being said, because okay, European countries are smaller, you do need to know what's happening in other countries. They speak a different language, right? You do want to know what's happening in the United States, or China. So you do pay attention. U.S. has had at various moments in time this idea of isolationism, and we're better than everyone. We don't need the rest of the world. We're going to pull back, kind of. We saw that did not work in the interwar period, and U.S. was pulled back into the international community in a war, basically, right? And then U.S. decides, okay, we're going to stay now. I think those lessons have been forgotten, and that's why we have a trend that says let's become isolated again. Well, what Jeremy was saying, like, yes, U.S. uses resources from all over the place. We tend to forget that the gas at the pump is most likely not coming from the United States. U.S. being a large producer itself, but it's most likely not from the United States. So we tend to forget that we do need to be members of the international community if we want the cheap clothes, the vacations overseas where we're not being targeted, right, for being Americans. And this may end, actually. So we'll see. I think this summer is going to be a test case. So we'll have again millions of Americans going to vacation in Europe, and let's see how they're going to be welcomed.
Well, some environmentalists might welcome this in the sense that the carbon emissions of a flight is particularly high. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about there's a small group of academics who considers as part of the no-fly movement, arguing that professors are relatively privileged, most flying is not required for your survival, therefore the right thing to do is to stop flying if you do not absolutely need to fly. And that would, of course, significantly impact study abroad programs, international exchanges, and all these benefits we know come from international education. So I was wondering if you could just comment on just that idea of the no-fly movement. What merits do you find to it? Why would you be opposed to it if so?
None. No merits. So honestly, this is one of those ideas that I think people in higher education get criticized a lot for by normal, regular Americans. Like, yes, I understand we're privileged and so on, but you do need to get places when you're in the United States. I mean, unless you're planning to drive to Canada and Mexico, doable, it's going to take days. Or take a boat to Europe, right? It's about 5 to 6 days. I did look into this out of curiosity, always thinking like, oh my God, what if the flights actually stop to Europe? How am I going to see family members back in Europe? And it actually did happen. Back in 2010, I want to say, with the Icelandic volcano that stopped.
Oh yeah, my friend visited me. I was living in Norway at the time. My friend visited me. He was trapped at my place for weeks because of that. Yeah.
Right. Look. These are the same people who probably drive to their campus daily, let's say half an hour one way, half an hour the other way, 1 hour, right? So calculate how much pollution that does at the end of the day compared to one flight to go to a conference if you need to, or to go because you have a study abroad option. I'm not saying abuse it. I'm not saying fly every week, right? But you do need, you live in the United States, right? Like, this is pretty much the only option you have. And it's not the 1930s or 40s or even 50s, right, to take the boat to Europe. I would love to to spend 5-6 days on a boat to Europe. I get good food, I get a beautiful ocean view, relaxing, and I get to read. Lovely, right? But I can also use my time in a much more productive way than that. And then again, like the carbon emissions are pretty high actually for a cruise like that, even though it's not a cruise, for a trip like that. So no, I'm actually not a fan of this at all. And I always point out, you know what? I actually walk to work every day. And other colleagues drive, from 30, 40, 50 minutes away, one way, and then do the same.
I can
other
verify.
way.
I often see him walking in 10-degree weather, and I offer him a ride to work sometimes.
Yes, I do accept it because I like to chat with you, I do walk.
So, looking at the crystal ball, given current trends, what do you think international ed looks like 20 years from now? And for any aspects you'd find undesirable in this future based on current trends, what are some budget-friendly interventions we should begin to implement now to prevent these undesirable futures? And one of the reasons I emphasize budget-friendly is an exercise I often do with my students is it's really easy to say, like, well, just spend more money on this to make it better, right? But we have to be honest that, especially in the current climate, we are in a, if not an actual recession, we certainly have drastic cuts in spending everywhere. So I'm asking you, I guess, to imagine, are there non-financial increasing, non-tax increasing ways to address some of the issues you are concerned about that might impact international education in the future?
Yeah, so part of me is worried that international studies is going to become something like we had the Dutch studies during the Tokugawa period of 1600 to 1868 Japan, where no contact with the rest of the world was allowed, with one exception, the Dutch. You're allowed to study what the Dutch are doing, you're allowed to learn the Dutch, you're allowed to understand their medical textbooks and business, right? Nothing else. So I'm really worried that you could actually lose your life during that time of Tokugawa. This is a samurai period of Japan that's peaceful, but they have no contact with the rest of the world, or very limited. You could lose your life if you're trying to understand, okay, what are the Chinese doing? What are the French doing? What are the English doing? That's the scary part, right? So the Eastern European pessimist in me is thinking, like, are we moving towards something like this, where even talking about the rest of the world is going to make someone a target? I don't think so, again, because we're so interconnected at the global level. The center of the academia has moved. It was... some would say it was in northern India like 2,000 years ago, and then it moves to the Muslim world, like Baghdad becomes a center, obviously Cordoba, Sevilla, Granada in Spain, and then it moves to Italy, and then it moves to France, and then it moves to England, and then it moves to Germany actually in the 19th century. The German universities, top notch, not anymore. And then it moves to the United States, right? So it's natural that it's going to move, right, from the United States too. I really hope it's not going to be during my lifetime, or at least as long as I'm working at an American university. But that's the natural trend of academia moving. Who can pick up this? Who can be the leader of academia in the world? I don't know yet. Could it be Europe? Europe is putting a ton of money in universities. I'm not seeing it yet. I'm not saying it's not possible that the pole will move towards Europe. And then you have like small success stories like Singaporean universities, I mean like top-notch universities, but then again, you live in Singapore with its limitations.
And as well as being a relatively small country, it's unlikely they're going to become a major powerhouse on the international stage.
There's only that many universities that you can have, on that tiny island at the end of the day. That's totally true.
And having done research in Singapore, it's not exactly a free expression place entirely, which often puts limits on your capacity to be a center of open inquiry.
Right, but I mean, we do have to question, are we going to have an exodus of academics from the United States to other parts of the world? And whoever is going to be, if this happens, whoever is going to be able to attract as many of the top-notch scholars from the United States, they're going to definitely develop their educational systems and their economies, most likely. Again, I am an Eastern European pessimist, but I'm also confident in the United States' ability to overcome any challenges. Yes, there will be downsizing, and we are losing, one institution of higher education a week, right? That is shutting down across the United States at this point. So maybe there were too many at the end of the day, right? Maybe we've been producing too many PhDs in the United States. So that needs to be cut. What you're talking about the finances, right? So how can we still have international education, international engagement, global engagement with limited funds? Look, I'm used to running things on a shoestring budget, so you can make it, and I take inspiration from our colleagues from overseas who make things happen on a shoestring budget. Part of it is passion, but I'm not a big fan of this martyr academic, who works only out of passion, doesn't get paid, and so on. Gets paid in, I don't know, like peanuts. No. But they find ways to work with local authorities, with businesses to make things happen. Even in Cuba, I've seen that right in at the University of Havana and other places like Turkey and so on. That if you're willing to create global engagement, you'll make it happen without being a martyr academic. So we're really privileged. I mean, our funding, we complain about it, but when you look at other parts of the world, we get a lot of funds at the university in the United States, even like at SUNY Cortland.
I'm curious. It seems to me there's a difference between having an experience per se, like traveling abroad, giving a talk, meeting some people at another institution, and building a deep kind of long-term relationship that becomes collaborative and maybe ends in some productive scholarly work or research of some kind. I don't know if you have any general thoughts on that. Like, what does it take to kind of make that jump from a handshake and kind of a relatively transient relationship to something that's more longer term? Does that require a lot more funding, or can that be done on a shoestring budget too?
No, that depends on the discipline too, because there are disciplines where you do need the cost. I mean,
if you need equipment or something like that.
Equipment and cost is significantly higher. Coming from the social sciences, we talk, right? Talk is cheap in many ways, right? I've seen colleagues traveling with them on this university delegations to see other universities who hit it off right away, and they're like, okay, they're pulling someone aside from the other university overseas, and they're going to lunch, and they're like, okay, after 2 hours, they've hashed out a research project that they're going to apply for a grant. They know exactly which grant they're applying for. So it's just realizing that this is how things work.
So part of it's just kind of a numbers game. Like, you don't know which relationships are going to work out
right.
and end in that way. So you just have to keep trying at it, and then
exactly and seeing connections. I mean, okay, I go to give a talk at a conference overseas, let's say, but it's not just that talk. I'm making a lot of connections. I'm saying, okay, I want that person, that university sounds interesting. So then even before I go to a conference, I look for the program as, okay, I want meetings with these people. So I email them in advance and set up the meetings with them during that time to figure out, okay, can we set up an institutional partnership? I really hope one day I'll be able to do this with a university in Botswana, right? So I've worked for the partners that we have in at Babeș-Bolyai University in Romania, which is not my alma mater, to get to Botswana, right? And others do the same, right? They point out like, okay, a connection clicks with someone, I don't know, in the University of Tenerife in Spain, and they're like, you need to talk to Alex at SUNY Cortland because you have similar interests. So connecting and making these connections, and you don't know what's going to happen. Like maybe I have 5 meetings and one of them ends up being successful. Like after that we have multiple Zoom or WebEx meetings, and then we actually apply for something together, or we co-write something together, or I put them in touch with another colleague here. One example, I go to a birthday party on Saturday at SUNY Binghamton. I start chatting with someone who ends up doing research in the same country as a colleague here, and they have a common friend from Belize. So on Monday, I send an email like, "Hey, you guys should meet. You're also nearby." So that's how it works internationally too.
Yeah. Yeah, you're doing real social networking there. Yeah, and it sounds like you're taking a very proactive position with your conferences that you attend. And I've been reflecting on this a little bit lately because I'm thinking about going to a conference this year, and it's actually been many years since I've been to a physics conference. Looking back at the conferences I've attended in the past, I think I got very little out of most of my conferences. And so it made me question the effort that goes into attending and bringing people to conferences. You're doing it right. You're clearly doing it. It sounds like, you're doing it right. You're planning it out. You're meeting people. You're making connections. But I imagine for the vast majority of graduate students and other people who attend these conferences, they're not nearly so proactive. And I think they get much less out of it. And so I guess I'm starting to kind of debate this with myself now. Like, what exactly am I going for this year? Do I just kind of want to see old friends? Is that why I'm going to this? Or do I actually really want to try to push something forward?
And that's exactly, I used to go to these mega conferences in the field where I realized it's just like an alumni reunion in many ways. Like the people who graduated from PhD at Illinois Urbana-Champaign were hanging out together.
And there's a lot of drinking that happens at conferences.
There's a lot of drinking too. And I'm like, okay, it's nice to see colleagues, right, from back in the days in grad school, but I'm not getting anything out of these conferences. I go to the panels, I wasn't necessarily impressed by what I was hearing. So I decided to go to different type of conferences that are smaller in size. We're looking at 35 to 50 participants. Yeah. You have a larger chance to interact with the people there, to create a community. Conferences that actually want to create an edited volume. So my last 3 publications came out of edited volumes that came out of conferences, right? So there's a different approach to conferencing that I've done. And then conferences that are tangential to my interests, like, oh, maybe this would be interesting, right? And I get amazing ideas. This really cool, like history conferences, and incredible connections from across the world, rather than going in circles with the same network, right?
And it's the same network, and oftentimes it's the same research,
right?
Or very incremental changes on the research. Right. A friend of mine years ago in grad school, we did a thing where we were going to make a game out of this, and we never actually did it. But we went and found the old conference proceedings from 1995, and we were going to compare that to conference proceedings from whatever it was at that point, 2010. And we were going to pull abstracts out there and see if people could tell the difference of what year was it. And we did it a little bit.
Just around the corner.
If you were really insightful and really knew the field, that particular subfield, you could probably guess pretty well. But most people, even in physics, wouldn't have been able to tell the difference.
And I respect that in a way, in the sense that new research is one standard deviation away from the previous research, right, that was done. So it's very close, right? The changes are very small, right? But what I personally cannot do that. I want to be stimulated. I'm curious. I want some other ideas. So I'm doing something different.
Yeah, and they also could be more likely to be a kind of targeted subject as opposed to these large, massive conferences where it's just like a cattle show of just hundreds of people, and often you can have a sense people are there more for their reunions than for.
Not to say that there's not good stuff that happens at those big conferences, but the good stuff I feel like is kind of like 1%, right? It's very dilute.
Yeah, and if I've gone to any of these big conferences lately, was just for the networking. It's like, okay, I know these people are going to be there. I don't get them at a smaller conference, so this is a good venue. But 90% of my conferences pretty much since the pandemic, have been smaller.
I think it's an interesting question to imagine how science or the social sciences would evolve, how it would change if we just eliminated conferences from what we do. Like, would that have any significant impact on our progress?
It's hard to know without knowing the counterfactual, right?
Oh, yeah, right. Maybe you could look back at like what happened in terms of productivity right around the pandemic when stuff just kind of cooled off for a year. People went into online conferences, which were terrible.
Well, I guess
did that impact people's progress much?
Well, aside even from like the potential to network and have productive outcomes like publications, etc. I think I just went to a sustainability conference in India last month, and it was just fascinating to learn about Indian culture through their conference, right? Like the way in which like several people would introduce, like before like I was introduced speaker, like 4 people had a conversation leading up to me, and there were gifts being exchanged along the way. So it's just kind of like it's an interesting way to get an insight into a culture just by being an international conference. It's just to get to be that experience, through the conference lens.
That's an international conference,
right?
Yeah, because a lot of the conferences in the United States tend to be the same type of hotels, the same type of structure.
Oh, they feel very corporate and mass-produced.
Right. And again, I had the surprise of not going to a conference, so I'm accepted. It was in Buenos Aires. It was 2 summers ago, and I'm like, you know what? I'm exhausted. I did already some traveling before, and I said, like, I'm sorry, I'm not going to make it. So I pulled myself back out of it, but the abstract remained in the program. And I get an email asking from a professor at University of Liège, asking if I want to submit the chapter that I was going to present, or the paper I was going to present as a book chapter. And I told the person, there is nothing written actually yet, because I was working on the project, but then I decided to stop like a couple of months in advance of the conference, so I didn't write actually anything. And he said like, well, it doesn't matter, like the abstract sounds really good. Would you like to write the chapter? I'm like, sure, why not? Like, so it gave me the impetus to actually write the book chapter, and it just got published recently. Too. It's like, wow, that I've never happened. Like, I don't go to the conference and then I'm asked to contribute the chapter.
One final question for me, for Alex here.
Sure.
Where are you traveling next, and for what reason?
Going to Tennessee to do an external review of the International Studies program at University of Tennessee, Chattanooga. That's my next trip.
Next international destination.
Next international, I should be going to Gibraltar for the Mediterranean Studies Association conference, which is one of my favorite conferences that I've recently joined, presenting a really cool project about, in my opinion at least cool, about travelogues and how Romanians in the 19th century traveling around the Mediterranean were perceiving the Mediterranean in a different way than Western Europeans. In a less condescending way, in a more like, oh, you're like us type of approach, especially for the northern part of Africa, southern part of the Mediterranean. So that's the project. I need to buy tickets and everything and look into that logistics, which I don't really enjoy. And, like, unlike some people on this podcast, yes, Jeremy, I'm actually not a big fan of traveling myself. I find it incredibly tiring. I don't like being cooped up in multiple planes for hours and hours and hours on end. I'm relatively a tall person, so that doesn't help. And I always get upset stomachs, and I can get sick easily when I travel. So I'm not really necessarily looking forward to that. I am looking forward to summer in southern Spain for at least a few days in Gibraltar and meeting this really cool group of people that was very inspiring last year at the conference.
But having just got back from Libya and Yemen, yes, those were long and grueling flights, but to be in those places, spectacular.
It is so good to be at home in the backyard to playing bocce with my daughters and wife.
I agree with that. I'm happy to be at home.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Balas, for taking your time to from your busy and committed studies, to international studies, for chatting with us on our podcast.
Thank you so much for
Yeah.
having me.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.